can be used to, that narrative is then diffused through sources like the media, where it reaches the ears of the people. Why is this profit ultimately illegitimate? It's because people are literally dependent on these corporations, and I'll take you in a second. So the corporation has a secure and, like our population, constantly growing market where they will always have a place within our world. When a corporation makes profit that fails these two criteria, that profit is necessarily theft. The impact of this argument is that you take advantage of people, even the most vulnerable people, and by making sure that these corporations grow themselves to be more powerful. And the link for this argument is that it proves why it should be supplied by the state and only the state. Why?
You keep saying that people are dependent on these corporations, but you would agree that there are many corporations, many options, versus you're switching to one government.
No, it's not. Because yes, you can buy Esca, you can buy Evian, you can buy Nestle, but ultimately those are owned by two corporations, Pepsi and Coca-Cola. So that's just factually incorrect. And if that's going to be the bulk of their argumentation, they're going to have like a huge case shift right now. So, third argument, developing democracies. So why are democracies? So recognize that developing democracies are necessarily new democracies, right? Because they're developing and they're fairly new in our world. The problem with this, though, is that the corporations that exist within these nations have existed for a far longer period than these nations themselves have existed. So they're well established and they have significant infrastructure and influence within the region so that they can literally do whatever they want. We bring to you the example of Chiapas, Mexico, which was where Coca-Cola bought a local waterfall and large source of water. They acquired the entire water source and controlled it privately. They developed infrastructure for Coca-Cola to just sell, to create and distribute Coca-Cola. I should realize. To distribute Coca-Cola within the region and throughout all of Mexico. But what did they do with this water source? They jacked up the price of water because it was the only local water source in the region, such that water was more expensive than Coca-Cola, necessarily forcing people to only buy Coca-Cola to drink. We think that that's extremely harmful because this is something like a tactic that corporations use around the globe, not just something that you can find in Mexico. So how do you shift the narrative on our side? By allowing countries to nationalize these sources of water and infrastructure, the people are guaranteed access to water because they're not going to be taken advantage of corporations due to legal loopholes that exist within the country. Moreover, if these nations don't actually have the means to create infrastructure in the water, we have good news for you, because these water companies are already set up in these countries, so they just have to nationalize the infrastructure that exists in order to supply that water to the people. The only way to stop these corporations from exploiting the people is to kick them out and take matters into our own hands. The impact is as follows: you guarantee access to water and ensure that even the most vulnerable actors are ensured to. Panel, if there's one thing you need to take away from the proposition, it's that prop is going to survive. This prop is going to side with the most vulnerable actors. We are the most principled. We think we are going to hold the principled high ground throughout the majority of this debate. We ask you to stand with the proposition.
We welcome Candace to the patient tonight.
Paper. You want a pen or paper? I carry this big.
Throughout this next speech, I will be showing you why not only on ideology they are wrong, not only on principles they are wrong, but in specifics and in reality what will actually happen because of their model are all wrong and will all lead to very bad impactful things. And I'm just not just making an extreme statement here. I'll be going line by line down each point and showing you why in fact the opposition side does stand against such an extreme case as theirs. Let's start off with the very beginning about what this House means. What they decided to do was limit the entire scope of today's debate to democracies, aka the good countries. Now, what's the problem with this? They're arbitrarily limiting the scope of today's debate to give them a distinct advantage. Because what they're saying is, oh, because democracies are always a good thing, we shouldn't be looking at the examples with a different type of government, and yet they then propose to socialize water. So they have to give you an example of where there's a socialized democratic society did a similar thing. But besides that point, we need a reason why they arbitrarily chose to limit it down to democracies and not all governments. Because I believe we should be looking at every example. Every country should be open for today's debate. There's no limiting terminology in the resolution that justifies their stance. Let's look at their next argument. This is a very big ideological argument that rights should be guaranteed by the state. And we as the opposition believe that rights should be protected by the state. That is going to be the difference in today's debate. Should we be protecting rights as the government or guaranteeing rights as the government? Now, I don't know about you if you've heard about Bernie Sanders, but he was a very popular politician in American politics. He made a very big worldwide impact because he was the first guy to kind of introduce this idea of democratic socialism. And he had some quite similar ideas. But the issue, the reason why Bernie Sanders and this overall ideology is wrong is because the government would have to supply everything else that is necessary. And what is necessary is different to different societies. For example, in America, a lot of Americans believe that guns are absolutely necessary. Would then the state would be required to guarantee that you own a gun? Is that what we're talking about here? I'm just simply showing you the logical principle that they're talking about is flawed. That if we apply it to other situations, we can see how crazy of an argument, how extreme it is in reality. We believe that the government's job is to protect your rights, not guarantee your rights. Because through the justice system and through the government, their job should be to protect and ensure that your rights are properly protected, that you have the ability to access all of your rights. That is our position, is about access and protection rather than a direct guarantee. And we'll be giving you reasons why for this philosophical argument, but let's go to the model. They propose three different things. I have a couple responses. First of all, there's no limit to how much you can drink. This is a very interesting argument because what this shows, what will essentially happen here is, can I just order or can I just use as much water as I want? Can someone just successively turn the faucets on in their home, leave water running? I wonder what will happen. They don't have to pay for that water. They can just drain all the water continuously and continuously. What will happen then? Water will just simply be draining and draining. And if, for example, if you own a pool, you could just put the water in your hose, have a lot of fun for the summer if it's very hot. But you're not thinking about conservation. The whole purpose, the whole ideology of conservation disappears with their plan. We're going to be wasting an excess amount of water, hypothetically, if you're going to be passing their plan. Let's look at my next argument. And the next argument is there's no way you can afford to supply this much water. There's no way a government can afford to supply this much water without excessively taxing their citizens. And they need to give you an example where excessive taxation through a progressive system actually worked. Let's move on to substantive 1, where they talked about how water is a principled right. And notice how I did ask him a question. So if water is a principled right, should the government supply a basic means of food? He said yes. Let me give you an example of where this ideology was flawed in the real world. Venezuela, 2014. In Venezuela of 2014, what happened was the oil prices plunged the entire country into an economic downfall. What happened? The government seized the means of production for food to guarantee their citizens' survival. What happened? People had to wait in lines for their food because they could not go buy it themselves, rather because the government owned and supplied it. It was all up to the government. How much you get, how much of a ration do you get? Because supplies were limited, the government rationed it to the people. This is a very important argument. Let's look over their next ideology, that the companies will coerce people into buying the water. There's no reason why the government could do the same. There's no reason whatsoever why the government could potentially do the same thing in the same scenario. Let's look at their last example of Chiapas, Mexico. And my response to this overall ideology was how Coke bought the waterfall and they were the only company around and they abused the people. I agree that was a bad situation. But that's not because corporations are inherently evil, rather because of a lack of competition. We're talking about competition here, because when there's only one company controlling an industry, or even one entity like the government, there's a lack of competition, meaning only one company can supply you the water. But when there's multiple companies supplying you a product, they compete to give you the most fair price. Whatever the most fair price is, that was the price that the consumers apply. I'll take your question.
If it's free, why do you need to have competition for a lower price?
Because, as I already explained through my arguments against substantive 1 with Venezuela and my arguments against your model, that essentially the government can potentially become as abusive and corrupt as corporations. And I'll be illustrating that point through my 2 substantives. My first substantive is that the government receives societal control. The second will be how the government receives economic control. And my partner will be discussing how competition prevents corporate his use. But let's move to substantive one. The government receives societal control. Because when looking at the perspective of a poor government, you must always make a profit. So if someone cannot afford water, you're going to be shutting the water off. My example of this is South Africa. Now, the lower class in South Africa the people cannot work enough hours in a day to actually afford water. So what happened? The government stepped in, took over all of the companies, and the government owned and supplied the water. But what happened? They were a poor government, and taxation was not working like they suggested. Progressive taxation was tried in this liberal democracy and it did not work. So what did? They had to shut off water to the people, and hundreds of thousands of people's water were shut off. This caused a detrimental effect. Why? Because in order to survive, they had to do two things. They had to drink out of contaminated rivers to survive. What is the problem of this and what was the result? The problem was contaminated rivers contained bacteria. And what the result was that the worst cholera outbreak in the history of South Africa occurred. And just in case so we all are clear, cholera is a deadly bacterial disease that causes dehydration, which leads to diarrhea and vomiting. And for people that can't afford water, this is more than a few trips to the bathroom. This is death. If you do not have water when you're excessively experimenting, I guess we could say, diarrhea and vomiting, that's the only word I can really use here, water is a very big deal. But let's look at another example, and that is of Bolivia. Now in Bolivia, people protested the government's water prices because, once again, the government had to sell water, and the government just shut their water off. They used it for political capital. Let's look at my next argument of how the government receives economic control. Because many industries require water to create their products, we're giving the government no control over different industries. Take, for example, the crop industry. All farmers need water to grow their crops. The government can essentially restrict the supply and then the demand of that industry in order to influence the economy in whatever way we see fit. We're not saying that governments will inherently become abusive. Rather, we're giving them more accessibility to abuse their power. That is the impact of this argument. That because we're giving them the ability to control the economy, we're giving them the accessibility to abuse their power. Thank you.
Now, welcome, Gabriel. Carry on the document.
Panel, think back to first arguments, right? We think that they were largely examples, right? And moreover, we think they were the most radical examples that they could have possibly given to you, right? We think that a lot of them don't fit into the model that we provided to you, that is to say democracies, right? That model that I'm going to be defending later on in my speech. Moreover, we think that since they don't apply to our model, we don't think they apply to this debate at all. Okay, so with that out of the way, I'm going to be going into refutation out of everything you've heard down the bench of opposition. Then we're going to rebuild my partner's case, and then go into our fourth constructive point of the team about accountability. Okay, first of all, refutation. So first of all, they give you this model attack, right? And they criticize us for only talking about democracies, right? Recognize that we think we have two responses to this. First of all, we think that because this motion can only be implemented properly in a liberal democracy, we think that is the case, right? That is the case in which we've chosen to talk about it. Moreover, since we think that the majority of cases this is going to be implemented is in liberal democracies, we think we're talking about the majority. In that sense, we think that we cover most of our bases in that sense. Okay, no, thank you. Then they give you this argument about wasting water, right? And they tell you that people are going to countries are going to start shutting off water supplies. Two responses to this. First of all, look at a place like California, right, where there is a significant, there is a drought right now, in the sense that they lack water, right? No, thank you. We think that at a certain point, the government decides that they're going to not allow people to water their grass on certain days. We think that those policies can also be implemented in different places in which in which our policy is implemented. No, thank you. Moreover, we question their rationality, we question their analysis as to why a rational person would leave the tap running all day. We don't think that they've actually, that was literally an assertion. They didn't provide you any analysis as to why a rational person would do that. Okay, no thank you. Then they talk
to in a second, actually. But then they talk to you about money, right? This is a quick one. Recognize that this is very mechanistic, and when we bring to the idea of like a progressive tax, we think it can be very easily paid for. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm actually from California, and you mentioned California, so I got a little excited here. So what you're essentially saying that in California, people cut their water. Now, are you aware that right now in 2017, those rules have absolutely changed because there's been so much rain in the last
Okay,
few
so
years?
that means that the problem was fixed, right? We think that that's not necessarily like a good, that's not necessarily like a relevant POI, right? If the policy, if there is a problem, they'll implement the policy. If that problem goes away, we can deregulate the policy. We don't think that's even like a remotely relevant POI. Okay, then they give you this idea, this idea of Venezuela, right? And this is like basically a character, like, you know, they give you a bunch of examples. They can all be summed into the idea of like Venezuela and Bolivia, right? Like, recognize that these are such radically different situations in which an enormous amount of political instability was present. We think that they can't possibly be like applied to this debate because of the fact that they're so radically different. No, thank you. Okay, with their entire case out of the way, I'm not going to, no, thank you. With their entire case out of the way, we're going to talk about rebuilding my partner's points. Recognize that before I get into refutation, they failed to engage with the majority of our principled analysis. They stuck to like taking down principled arguments. Rather, I'm going to start rebuilding those right now. So when Jared talks to you about how water is a principled right, they tell you two things, right? First of all, they tell you the government exists to protect rights. Okay, fine. So life is a right that all people have. So when you provide water to people, you protect that innate right of life. No, thank you. We think that without the water being provided by the government, right? Like a lot of people will not be able to protect their right of life just because of the fact that water is innate to that right of life. Moreover, they bring to you this example of guns, right, in America, we think that like that's very different, right? Because people aren't going to die if they don't have guns. People are going to die if they don't have water. Okay. The second one was like very largely untouched, right? They did not engage with a lot of the principled analysis we gave you. What did they actually engage with? They engaged with the idea of like this coercion, right? They told you about competition. And this was also the response to our third point. So it's going to sound a little bit repetitive. I'm going to go into that too. They talked to you about competition, right? Recognize that Pepsi and Coke do end up working together, right, to hike prices for their products. We think that when the majority of the water industry is controlled by two major corporations, at that point it becomes like no, thank you. Like when two major corporations own the majority of the water industry, they can work together to do things like hike prices because in the end, right, as a corporation, your primary incentive is to make profit, and at the point where you're working together with your competition to hike prices because you are the two biggest giants in the game, right? At that point, that makes sense to make money, so they're going to do it. We need to see a legitimate response to that out of opposition. Then in our third point, we talked about developing democracies and how they're taken advantage of by corporations, right? We told you how there is a necessary thing that the government needs to do, that is to say regulate private corporations not regulate, rather start to make water distributed by the state so that these things stop happening, right? They also brought to competition here, and they said that it wouldn't happen. I'm going to engage with this mostly in my constructive about why water corporations are not held accountable by the people. So we think that at the end of that, my partner's case entirely is still standing. Okay, now my constructive point about accountability, right? The thesis of this argument is that the state is a much more viable actor than private corporations to provide water to the people, on the basis that the state is actually held accountable by the people, right? Why is that? Because when these states start to control water, the people have a medium to voice their dissatisfaction with the state. That is to say, voting or having protests against the government, right? We think that at the point where the people no longer have a mechanism to provide accountability to private corporations, is the point at which they can do whatever they want, right? That is to say, when you protest against a corporation, right, we think that does very little because of the fact that corporations have a large amount of political capital. More, we think they have a large amount of actual capital in terms of money and legal teams that they can use to hamper your movement, right? Moreover, let's take them in their best case scenario, right? Assume a boycott has actually assume people actually boycott products, right? We think that there are 3 reasons why this won't actually work, right? Because big corporations have a lot of money, in which that they use, that they can use to use to avoid a boycott insofar as avoid losing profit in a boycott. No, thank you. We think that corporations have an enormous amount of money, especially when it's controlled by 2 major water giants, and at that point, no, thank you. At that point, they're able to continue making profit while boycotts are happening. Second idea, right? There's a monopoly, right? There's a monopoly between Coke and Pepsi. So because everything is owned by Coke and Pepsi, I'll take you in a second. because everything is owned by Coke and Pepsi, right? When you boycott one water company and you directly go to another, at that point, like you're shifting your the money that you give to these corporations from one to another. In which, like in most cases, it's still the same company that owns both. We don't think you actually make a difference. Go ahead.
Are you saying that it is factually true that the only two corporations in the entirety of the
Okay,
world
so when you're going to deal with absolutes, like I understand you are, when you're going to deal in only absolutes, like we think that they kind of strawman our case by trying to make me deal in absolutes, right? We think that at the point where the vast majority of water corporations are owned by Coke and Pepsi, we think our point still stands, and if they're going to try to take the smallest out, that is to say that well, it's not an absolute, right? We don't think that's a legitimate piece of analysis. They need to have like better analysis than that to take down arguments. Okay. So yeah, so then third idea, like as to why boycotts don't work, is because like they're actually like it's because they're all guilty, right? Most water corporations are guilty, that is to say both Coke and Pepsi, and most other corporations, like most other smaller corporations, that own water corporations, are also to blame in terms of like exploitation and polluting water, right? We think at that point they're all guilty, and you're arbitrarily placing your blame on different corporations. At that point, it doesn't like you don't get your point across, you lose legitimacy. What are the impacts of this, right? We think that like first of all, we think we get like a much better benefits in terms of sustainability. Why is that? Because if a corporation starts exploiting a lake or a spring in a way that causes pollution that like makes the population unhappy, at that point the population has no means of like accountability towards that corporation. Whereas if the state were to do that, they would have a lot more like they would be able to vote out the government or protest against it. We think we get a lot more accountability. Because on that basis, we're very proud to propose.
I'll let you continue talking.
Essentially, what the proposition team has done in their last speech is time and time again attempt to define the opposition team out of the round entirely. Essentially, what they're saying is any example we bring up, well, according to our definitions, that's not really real. Also, those are kind of extreme examples, so we don't really want to count it. Time and time again, they're not actually refuting our arguments. Instead, they're just saying, no, we don't really want to listen to your examples. So with that aside, let's go ahead and address each of the specific arguments in today's debate round. Then I'll move on and present the final substantive of the opposition team. So to start out, I'm saying that this motion can only be implied successfully in a liberal democracy. Well, that right there is defining us out of the round. Essentially what they're saying is we are only looking at the cases where the proposition side wins. Clearly that is not a fair debate. We're not actually going to have a debate if we can't look at all the different cases. If they're saying we're only going to look at it where it works out well, great, you just won the round. But we're not going to debate like that. We're going to look at it at a worldwide scale because that's what the motion was implying for us to do. Now, the next argument that they were discussing was how it was an assertion no rational person is going to leave the water running. I'm going to ask you as rational people whether or not you guys like long showers or shorter showers. I think that a lot of us in here like to take longer showers. However, when there is a water shortage, when we know that perhaps the price of water is going up, or there's a general water shortage in the town, we're going to use less water. I know my dad has specifically told me in a few different instances, okay guys, for now we're just going to take shorter showers for the next few weeks. We did it because we're paying more for the water. If no one has to pay for their water, any rational person is going to use more water. They did refute our argumentation. Instead, they just said that no rational person would do it. Their next argument was that Venezuela and Bolivia are radical examples. That was the extent of their refutation. They didn't actually refute anything that went on in those examples. Now, my response to that is those are not actually radical examples at all. In fact, we're discussing democracies there. Specifically, we brought up the example of South Africa. And again, he didn't refute the actual argumentation. Instead, he just disregarded our examples. Next, they went on to say that life is a right and the government has to protect that. Now, I agree, life is a right. It is the government's job to protect the right, but not to guarantee the right. So for the example of life, it's not the government's job to send us each out with bodyguards to really protect our lives, but it is the government's job to have normal protections against life. So it's the government's job to give us reasonable access to water. So if we have people who are cut off from access to water, yes, the government should come in and give them water. For example, there was a town in the United States that recently had a water crisis. For instance, their water that they were drinking, something happened to that plant for the entire town, was not drinkable. What did the government do? They sent in water bottles. And that chance, it was the government's job to give them water because they didn't have reasonable access. But in general, across the board, it's not the government's job to guarantee that access to water, rather to provide with reasonable access. Now, right now, their next argument was discussing Pepsi and Coke, and they said that the two work together. Now, my first response is that there are not only two water companies in the world. Now, maybe that's true in Canada, I'm not really sure about that, but I know for a fact that that is not true in the rest of the world. And even if that were true, even if there were only two companies, well, two is more than one. We're going to have two companies versus one government. We will have more competition and a better access to water underneath the opposition side. Now, the next argument is discussing how there's much more viable and they're going to be held accountable to by people, the governments are. Now, our response to this is first off Bolivia. We know for a fact that that's not true, that's not what happened. Their argument does not stand in the real world. The second response is that corporations need money. The government doesn't need money. They were saying that the governments have to listen to their people. However, that's simply not true. Corporations are in place to make money. They must have consumers. Governments can ignore their people. They're not really harmed by that, and they absolutely can. There will be more harm with the governments in place, yes?
I think a concrete harm is not being voted in the next election.
I don't believe I understand your question. But okay, sounds like that was a statement, so we'll go ahead and move on. Now, the next argument, they were discussing how most corporations are guilty. I would like to say that is factually inaccurate. Most corporations are not jacking up their prices and cutting off access to water. That's simply not true. Again, underneath that point, they didn't provide any evidence or any other reason for us to believe that. The next argument is that the government is more sustainable. My response to this is South Africa. Right, it was sustainable. They immediately cut off access and people did not have access to water. Now, with all the arguments addressed, we'll go ahead and move on to the final substantive from the opposition team. That is that competition prevents corporate abuse. Now, essentially what we're looking at in this point is in the current system, without the state being in charge of the water, why it's still good, why we still have protection and we still have access to water. Now, we know that competition in a market, just a general explanation of what competition is, it's incentives to provide better services. So essentially, if there are multiple companies that are in the same market, they all want the business, they're all going to do their best to make the companies happy, the consumers happy. Now, consumers go for two different things. They want the highest quality at the lowest price. So what do corporations do? They work to give the consumers the highest quality at the lowest price so that they are able to make money. Now we see that companies want to have more consumers, it's in their best interest to work towards that. And because there's not only one company, they have to make a real effort to do that. But when we switch it to the government doesn't have to switch up anything. They don't have to go out and make consumers like them or work for the betterment of the consumers. Rather, they have guaranteed customers. There's no reason for them to improve the service or do it well for the consumers. So we see that underneath the current system, there is no risk of harm. We see that we will have competition. Now, even looking at those specific instances where maybe there is a risk of harm, we can accept their Pepsi and Coke example for just a second. So sure, maybe in that one instance, there was a risk of harm. But what do we see? In the worst case scenario underneath the opposition team, we don't help everybody, but we do provide some accountability. We do provide competition. So when we look at the big picture, the majority of people are helped. That's looking at the worst case scenario. We're going to have these random, very few instances like the Coke and Pepsi example that they brought up. But looking at the best case and the more likely case that would happen underneath the opposition side, we see that competition is going to provide the highest quality at the lowest price for the consumers. So worst case, we're going to have just a few different corporations, very, very rare instances. They were only able to present to you one single instance where this was actually an issue, versus what we have presented to you were three different governments where they abused that power over the water and we saw it resulted in death. That's what we're talking about. Not just people raising their prices and having to pay a bit more, but we're actually talking about death, like in South Africa when people had to go drink contaminated water and got diseases. So what we looked at today is essentially they can't just define us out of the ground. We need to be debating this across the world. And even if we were going underneath their definitions, our examples absolutely fall under the definitions. We were bringing up examples of liberal democracy, and they still do stand in today's debate. Then we went on and saw that they were continuing to make assertions. They were just refuting the credibility of our arguments, of our examples, rather than refuting the actual argumentation. They were really debating what we were presenting, rather they were just giving us minor reasons to disregard examples. I don't believe that's good debate, and hopefully for the rest of the round we can actually debate the principles, rather than just saying we don't really want to listen to that debate. Finally, we saw that competition prevents corporate abuse. So when we have competition in the system, we are going to be better off. 2 companies is better than 1 government, but in most cases, we're going to have many, many more companies than 2. Thank you.
We also, if they're carrying the team members.
I'm going to start off by doing something that I was really hoping I wasn't going to have to do in the semifinals, and that's explain debating 101, right? Because I think that opposition needs to understand that examples aren't argumentation. They need to provide us analysis as to why the examples that they list off, even though they don't fall under our model, necessarily are going to carry over in all the cases that we talked about. We think that even in the cases, even if that were to be the case, we think principally our case still stands, and we think that is something that's extremely important. What am I doing in this speech? I'm going to be boiling this debate down into 3 main themes. Firstly, I'm going to be talking about rights. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about profit. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about sustainability. So I'm going to start off by the 2 principal themes, because we think the most important thing about this is that the principle is not actually contingent on any practical benefits, because we're saying that we should implement this policy. We think that is something that is a crucial distinction to make, because we think that this policy is something that would be good for the world, and that's why it should be implemented. But we also tell you that there are practical implications to this as well. Okay, let's talk to you about rights. So they firstly explain to you this really kind of wishy-washy stance about rights, where they say that the government has an obligation to protect your rights, but they don't have an obligation to guarantee your rights, right? So we think that it still falls under the obligation of a government protecting your rights will still entail guaranteeing them water, because we don't see how they're necessarily mutually exclusive. Because we think that actually guaranteeing someone a right still falls under the category of protecting their right. We think that that is something that is objectively good. You are still fulfilling the right. You are still fulfilling the obligation of the government. Just because the government is doing more than they need to, that doesn't mean that that's a bad thing and that's something that they shouldn't do. We think the government who go through the works of helping their citizens have a better quality of life is a good government. Is a government that the people should support. Okay, so what do we tell you on our side? We bring to you a much better rights analysis as to why this right should actually be guaranteed. We don't think that opposition actually deals with this, right? Because Jared explains to you why the right to water is necessarily something that should be guaranteed by the state. He explains to you that a state has the obligation to its people to guarantee them things like the right to life, like the right to human dignity. He explains to you why water is necessarily linked to that. The link that he gives to you is that he explains to you why water is necessarily linked to people's subsistence. The point at which you can't drink water is the point at which you cannot survive, the point at which you cannot exercise other rights that exist within that you are able to carry out within society. We think that the access to water is a very basic right, a fundamental right, that is the only way you can actually carry out other rights that exist within society. We think that is why the government actually has an obligation to guarantee this. We tell you that the point at which you have to pay for water, and and the point at which you are dependent on corporations who have no obligation to you, by the way, for water, is the point at which that right is not actually guaranteed to you. Because the point at which they are able to rise the price up where you can't and you can't afford it, that is not guaranteed to you. We think that is something that is important. We think on the idea of rights and on the government's obligation to you, we think that we clearly win on this regard. Because we think that the only response that they tell us is the government we're respecting the rights too much. We think that that's basically telling us that we win under this. Let's talk about the second theme, but first I'll take it.
So we gave you an example of hundreds of thousands of people dying when the government had control of the water. Can you give me one example of someone who died while corporations?
Okay, first of all, that was principled analysis. You can't deal with it with one example, but we tell you that even if that example is there, we tell you that that doesn't necessarily mean that's going to happen in every case. We think that it's going to be we think that if we implement this in liberal democracies as Jared set out, in a lot of cases it's going to work. People are going to be better off. We think that they can't just take that down with the example of something. Okay, let's talk to you about profit. We hear some weird analysis from opposition in this regard. Firstly, they tell you that competition drives the price down. At POI, there was first speaker about this, about how when water is literally free, there is no longer a need for competition. And then they tell you that the government is somehow going to go rogue and start selling water to people for absurd amounts of money. I don't think that that's something that they can claim. I think in a liberal democracy where you can hold your government accountable, that's not something that's going to happen. But moreover, on the idea of competition and how that keeps prices low, we don't think that that's necessarily that's always the case. Like Jared talks about like the oil industry, and I think I'm going to bring that up again because if you look at things like OPEC, where countries get together to rise the price of oil in order to maximize their profits, I think that is something that is extremely viable, that is likely to happen with water corporations, and that we see corporations actually doing. Because we think that there is like the analysis, they can't just say that this doesn't happen. We give you analysis as to why it could happen and why it probably does, right? Because when Pepsi and like Coke, which maybe aren't the only companies, have an actual incentive to raise the price of water because it makes them more money, we tell you there's an incentive for them to pollute, there's an incentive for them to raise the prices. We think that that is something that is problematic. We also the idea of like accountability through competition, we think isn't necessarily the case because you can't sure you have two choices or like three choices, but we think that's not necessarily accountability because a lot of people don't actually realize that water corporations are linked or fall under the same thing. Like under Coca-Cola Company, like people will think that because there's several different branches that supply water, people will buy different ones within that. They still fall under the idea of Coca-Cola. We think that you don't actually necessarily have choice. But we think that accountability is necessarily better on our side because of the analysis that Gabriel brings to you. He tries to bring that up in the POI, and they can't just respond to that by saying they don't understand. Okay, so why is why is our accountability necessarily better? Because there is actually no direct accountability for a corporation to the people that are buying the product, comparatively to government. Because governments in liberal democracies, you literally elect them in an election to look out for you and to do what's in your best interest. Corporations, you don't have that same social contract with corporations. They have no accountability towards no thank you. So what do we talk to you as well under the idea of profit? Jared explains to you analysis as to why this profit is necessarily illegitimate. They don't actually clash with this. Because firstly, what did he actually tell you? Firstly, he explains to you why profit is illegitimate at the point where people literally cannot opt out of this and they're actually dependent on these corporations. He explains to you why it's theft when they have to go to these corporations and give them money for something that they require in order to live. He tells you that that's a point. But he also explains to you why these people are actually misinformed by these companies, because companies have an incentive to actually make profit. He gives you the example of the advertisements about 8 glasses a day, where companies are actually trying to get people or force people into buying more than they need in order for them to actually get profit. We think that is something that's bad. When people are misinformed about that sort of thing, that profit is necessarily legitimate. Okay, third theme, let's talk about sustainability. So on the idea of sustainability, in their first speech, they basically gave us slightly radical analysis about how people are just going to go in their houses and leave their taps on for days in a row. And we don't think that that's something that's likely going to happen in the idea of a rational act. But we think that on the idea of things like taking long showers and stuff like that, if water is free, because we think that people aren't going to people are already taking 30-minute showers in the status quo. I don't think people are going to change to an hour because that's an absurd amount of time. I think people are just not going to waste any more time than they already do in the shower just because the price is low. Okay, what did we talk about? We talked about the idea of sustainability and why that's actually better guaranteed on our side. Because because we give you tangible reasons why sustainability is better. Gabriel's analysis is what I'm flagging right here. So he talks to you why governments are accountable to the environment because the population wants the environment to be respected. When they feel like the government is exploiting the environment and putting them and the future generations of their family at risk, the people are going to be upset, the people are going to stand up to the government, and that politician is not likely to get reelected because that is the accountability that he gives you and tries to bring up at a POI, and they just try to say that they don't understand. But we also tell you that governments actually have more of an incentive to do things like invest in technology to actually do this in a sustainable way because they have to look out for a long-term plan, whereas corporations don't. They can just leave when all the lakes are dried up and they have no incentive to help in the end. So on our side of the house, we think that we have the principled high ground in which we respect the most vulnerable actors within society, but we also think that we benefit the population as a whole. And so on that basis, we're proud to be
Are you kidding me? What's good?
The proposition team has done a lot of things. One thing they have not done is explain to you why governments are inherently less susceptible to abuse than corporations. Because what I will explain to you today is that neither side is perfect. Corporations are not perfect, governments are not perfect, and both sides will have examples of abuse. The question in your minds today should be which side has more ability to abuse. And what we have explained and will continue to explain is that because of competition, corporations inherently have more restrictive capabilities in order to restrict water than governments who have no control and no competition whatsoever. I'm going to explain this through 3 flashpoints where we're going to talk about what falls under the motion, because what the proposition team has done is every time we bring up a seemingly good argument, they somehow define it out of the realm so they don't have to actually debate it. The second flashpoint is whether or not corporations are more abusive than governments, and then finally we'll look at the economic aspect because they completely dropped their second substantive where we talk about how the economy is controlled by the government. Let's start off with the first flashpoint with what falls under the motion. Now they talked about how examples are not argumentation, and that's absolutely true. However, the first problem with this is they contradicted themselves, because their only example of corporate abuse is one example of Coca-Cola and Pepsi. And I'll go more in depth later, but they've essentially said one example doesn't prove your case, and then only provided one example to prove their case. Ultimately, what we see is that examples prove the argumentation provided. Now the argumentation we provided, specifically dealing with South Africa, was talking about how even though the government had that, because ultimately there was no accountability, then what happened is the water was ultimately restricted. And we talked about how they then had to drink dirty water, and that led to more hundreds of thousands of deaths. And this is an example they cannot simply ignore because it's not going to happen 100% of the time. Now, what the proposition team is trying to tell you is because it doesn't happen 100% of the time, it's the extreme and should not apply. That is 100% false, because what this is an example of their system they claim is so perfect and acceptable, failing miserably. And we have no examples, no argumentation from the proposition team to say that would not happen in other instances. We completely agree. Not 100,000 more people die every time the proposition system is used, but that is absolutely a possibility. Now, furthering this, they talked about how we should not pass a policy because of practical benefits, but it should be on principles. I would say that when we're looking at principles, we should pass policies that practically uphold those principles. So if our goal is to protect rights or give more people access to water and prevent abuse, if corporations do that, practically speaking, that upholds the principle. So they cannot say, because our side doesn't fail or because our side fails more, then we should base it on principles. What we should base it on is that practically they would actually uphold these principles, and the opposition side does. They talked about how we should guarantee these water and these resources, and they again ignored our basic analysis is that government should provide or allow the access to these rights, but not guarantee them. It is improbable for the proposition to say they should and can guarantee every single basic right. If that were true, we talked about how they would give security guards to literally every single citizen everywhere around the world, because that would guarantee their rights. Right now we give them access to water with corporations, but guaranteeing it is not a burden on the government, and that is an unreasonable one for them to say. Yes, I'll take your question.
Do they have a police force in the United States?
Absolutely, but that does not watch people 24/7. There's no guarantee people would not die. Otherwise, there would be literally no death in the world. The fact that crime exists disproves any argument that they brought up on that issue. Guaranteeing is not the burden of the government, it is allowing and access to this water, and access to water is provided by corporations. Now the next flashpoint we want to deal with is essentially whether or not corporations are more abusive than government, because I think most of the debate round comes to this issue, because I think they will agree no side is 100% perfect, and there are abuses on each one. The question is which side has more accountability. Now, in the proposition time, they talked about elections and said making sure you're elected next year incentivizes you. And there was a multitude of problems with this example. The first is what happens when, example, in the United States, you come to your second term and then you have no re-election. The second problem is you say, do this at the beginning of your election. Are they saying people should have to wait 4 years in order to have access to water again? It's a flawed example to say elections are the only incentive for presidents or other people. And the third is what about Russia? What we have in Russia is what they would call, technically speaking, is a democracy, and yet Putin has been elected constantly because there's not real democracy. In fact, there was a poll once that said he won by 165%, which isn't possible. And so while they are labeled democracies, they are actually democratic, and so he doesn't worry about having to be reelected, which is why he can abuse his people, and those are the situations that the proposition team gets into, but want to ignore because they are outside of today's debate. Now the next thing I want to talk about is dealing with, where we talk about how people will want more water, and the issue with this is that assumes they are paying right now. In the United States, people do pay water bills. In most countries, they pay some sort of water bill. When the proposition team makes that free, they have no reason to restrict their water. They have no reason to take a 30-minute shower instead of an hour one. But furthering this, they ignored our analysis where we talked about how even if these people have free water for a little bit, ultimately it will lead to taxation, because no country can indefinitely sustain themselves to provide water to every single citizen of every single country around the entire world. And that is the flaw in their thinking, that it won't lead to a taxation. So all of their arguments about how this will be free, I would ask you to honestly fairly ignore, because sure, that will happen for a little bit, but what happens when the government actually needs money to sustain itself, because they cannot provide unlimited resources to its citizens. Now the next point under here deals with essentially whether or not of economic growth. Because again, our second contention was that of economic control, and that it was something that was completely ignored by the proposition team. So not only is there societal control, where we have poor governments who need money to sustain themselves and are focused on sustaining themselves rather than their people all the time, we also have economic control. We talked about how there are many industries, such as the soda industry, crops, as well as water mills that require water, and now what we have is a single entity determining who and what corporations can run that. Now the problem with this is that there is no guaranteed accountability. What you have on the government side is instances where there are be accountable. Sure, someone has 1 month left and they want to be elected next term in the United States. That is one single instance where maybe their plan would actually work. Maybe they have an incentive. But that does not outweigh the fact that corporations constantly have accountability, because with the water industry, despite what they have told you, there are not only 2 corporations covering water around the entire world. There are hundreds and thousands, and all of them have to compete with each other to ensure the lowest price. The problem with the proposition team's case is not that they want to protect rights, but rather they have defined every good argument, in a sense, out of the realm. Furthering this, they've essentially claimed that there was more abuse within the government without giving you a single logical or analytical reason to say that is so. Obviously, neither system is perfect, but what the corporations have that the governments do not is guaranteed accountability, because there will always be competition, whereas governments, there was only one of them. They have no accountability, and their only accountability they provided, we have clearly disproved, saying that is not the instance at all, or even the majority of cases. So I would ask you vote for the opposition's world, because what we can guarantee to you is more accountability than the proposition team can. I don't want you to vote for the proposition team because we are perfect. I do not want you to vote for the proposition team ultimately because they fail 100% of the time. But I want you to vote for the opposition team because when you weigh their 2 worlds together, the accountability and the accessibility of water goes to the side of the opposition.
This stopwatch thing is pretty cool, don't you think? Spark stuff.
Using all of its data.
I, as a teenager, sometimes really like to take long showers. Just sit in the shower and think of just the most random things in the world. And I can just waste water however much I want. Why? Because I don't have to pay for it. I don't have to pay for it. My parents have to pay for it, so I don't care. The same thing will happen under this proposition of law. If the people don't have to pay for it and they know someone else is paying for it, conservation doesn't matter anymore. While this simple instance really is funny, it's reality. It is a simple humanity. Humans do not care if something is free. If something is free, it's no longer valuable to them. I value my iPhone because it costs a lot of money. I value my research that we did because I spent a lot of time on it. If you don't have any effort or did anything to earn something, you're not going to value it. You're going to waste it. So I'm going to be examining the principal arguments and then the specific arguments, and then looking at the best case and worst case scenario. Let's first start off with the principal arguments. The first one is about access or guaranteed rights. Now, I want to remind you that we as the opposition stand for guaranteeing access to resources. We are not saying that the government's job is to give every single person water, rather guarantee that those people have access to water so things that they're mentioning will not happen in the first place. Why does this matter? Because it's realistic, first of all. And second of all, we brought up the example of bodyguards. Safety, as they brought up, life it should be a guaranteed right. Does that mean that the government should protect life? Maybe we should all go into like a bubble-wrapped room, or we should never drive a car because that could potentially harm us. You see, we never know how far the proposition case will take us. They have never clarified this. But let's look over the next principal issue, the principle of conservation. My argument here is that the principle of conservation is not upheld with the proposition case. Their model does not declare conservation something that is important. And our analysis addressed that, and their only argument, no reasonable person would do that, that's ridiculous. They never directly challenged our analysis, argumentation, or logic. They just called it ridiculous. That's all they said in today's debate round. Let's look over the next line of argumentation, and that is of whether the government has more potential to abuse, or companies have more potential to abuse. Let's examine the two different worlds. In the world of the opposition, the worst case scenario that could happen is that there are two companies that they brought up, Coca-Cola and Pepsi, competing to bring prices. That is the worst case scenario that they claim, which, by the way, is only one example, and I'll be getting to that in a bit. The best case scenario for the proposition case does not have any guaranteed accountability for the government whatsoever. I'll be giving you 3 layers of analysis of why this is true that I've already brought up in our speech, but were never addressed by the proposition. First of all, we're giving the government full economic control. Our substantive 2, they never had one argument against substantive 2, where we discussed how water is necessary for crops with farmers. So if the government controls water, they control our food supply because they can restrict water to the farmers or give water to the farmers, which increases supply and demand. We also talked about the beverage industry, where even if to make our favorite products, like Coca-Cola, we need water in the first place. Coca-Cola requires 3 liters of water for 1 bottle of Coke. This is factually true. So what does this mean? The second layer of analysis is of political control. They also dropped our argument of Bolivia, our second example, under the argument of the government receives societal control. Because in Bolivia, people protested against the government for taking over their water. They did not like it. That was their opinion. What did the government do? They just shut the water off to the citizens, and that shut them up pretty quickly because they had no water to survive. So what does this show? It shows no accountability whatsoever. The third argument about elections, they said, well, wouldn't that be a great incentive for a politician? Because politicians would have to do well. They can't abuse anything because their citizens, of course, would do something in the next election cycle. But once again, Noah already explained the hypothetical argument of how you'd have to wait a couple of years for another election because elections don't happen every single year for most countries. So for all of these reasons, and even if it is true that their whole argument, especially under South Africa, who made up the argument that this is one example, even if that argument is true that the one example is false, Coca-Cola is one example as well. Thank you.
Not closing by Jared. It's not good.
Thanks. Opposition grossly mischaracterizes our entire case, our refutation of their arguments, and most of what happens throughout this debate. And we think that it's unfair for them to do that for a couple of reasons. First of all, when we dismiss the most part of their examples, we tell you that those are actual isolated, very radical examples. They can call them arguments all they want, but they never provided concrete analysis as to why those examples would carry over into the majority of cases. And like Nabil tried to point out within the beginning of his own speech, he tried to point out that in order to prove in order to win this debate, you need to prove that their side is going to carry that all their harms will happen in the majority of cases. Those isolated radical instances are not the majority of cases. That's why we disposed of them, because there was no analysis. 3 themes. We're first going to talk about accountability and the role of the government, and third, on the principle. In terms of accountability, they tell us that corporations hold each other accountable and that we can't actually hold a government accountable. We told you that Pepsi and Coca-Cola were to actively work together in order to up the price of water, much like OPEC does with the oil market. Why do we win accountability? First of all, I think it's laughable to assert that corporations hold each other accountable at the point where literally all of them are profit-driven. When 2 corporate giants rule the market, it is necessarily in their best interest to work together so that they can up the price of water so they can make more profit. No response other than saying that that wasn't true. They need to respond with concrete analysis. It's too late. All right. Second note, why can governments actually be held accountable? It's because a government only exists because the people put them in that place, right? Because we're talking about liberal democracies. At the point where I can say, I am not electing the Democratic government, the Democratic Party again, I'm going to vote the Republicans in because the Democrats denied me water, that's when the point where I can hold my government accountable, right? Because there are multiple parties that exist within that system. They needed to respond to that too. And I think that it's fairly laughable to assert that in a democracy, you can't hold your government accountable. Can you prove to me, they never pointed out, are democratic governments necessarily murdering all of their opposition under the status quo? No, because they can be held accountable. Role of the government. They talked about protecting rights. We talked about guaranteeing rights. Now this seems kind of pedantic, but you know what? Ultimately, I think what proposition takes it because they're both the same thing. Why? Do we actually guarantee rights under the status quo? We tell you that in the majority of democracies, you do guarantee rights. You guarantee legal rights at the point where you supply an attorney to an individual who can't afford them. But moreover, we tell you that water, that water is different from something like safety. So you don't have to have a police officer following you around because you don't fear for your life at the point where you leave. At the point where you literally will die after 3 days of no water, that is the point when water is something that is a constant threat to you and you require to have to keep yourself hydrated. That's why it's an intrinsic right, because it's something that's necessary to live. You don't absolutely need someone following you in all instances. But furthermore, we think that they fail to protect rights at the right to life at the point where I, as an individual living on 10,000 euros a year, have to choose between am I going to hydrate myself tonight, or am I going to feed myself, or am I going to house myself, or am I going to keep myself warm? Okay? They never address the fact that we're helping the most vulnerable actors. No analysis. And lastly, the principle. Oh boy. No engagement whatsoever, other than saying that our principle was contingent on practical implications. No, because this House believes that notion, which means that the principle is completely not contingent on any practical implications. If something is empirically, if something is intrinsic to a human's rights or a person's a person's freedoms, that means that it should be guaranteed by the government. At the point where we stood up and proved two separate arguments that you literally cannot survive without water, that the government has a principled obligation to give that to you in order to guarantee your right to life, we think that that's the point that we prove that the principle is not contingent on any practical whatsoever. Well, I think this debate largely falls onto proposition. We sweep this debate on the basis that we actually provided to you concrete analysis as to why our examples and why our arguments will hold in the majority of cases. It's for all those reasons we beg to propose.
Let's give both teams a wonderful hand.